such a genuine gem. Thank you for clicking on my video. I'm Brooke McKenna, but today's case is the deadly Halloween love, the trick-or-treat murders of 1957. Now, a love triangle with taboo elements would eventually cause a murder to be solved. However, the real question is why and who were really involved. By the way, this is ODDtober, where I'm posting the spookiest content all month long, and if you're wondering why my background is different and the lighting isn't the best, it is because I am out of town. I still wanted to film for you guys, so I figured I could do a makeshift video background and setup, and I really hope that it's okay because this case is super strange and I knew you guys would want to hear about it. So let's get into the story. So it was 1957 in California, and Betty and Peter Fabiano lived in Los Angeles. They had gotten married 2 years prior and were now owning 2 successful beauty shops, or basically hair salons, that they were really flourishing in. They had 2 children, well, Betty did, from her previous marriage that were Judy and Richard Solomon. However, Peter really treated them as though they were his own. In fact, Richard was in the Navy at the time at a San Diego base, and Peter absolutely loved that his stepson was in the Navy because he had been a former United States Marine. At the time, the other child, Judy, was still a teenager and still living at home. Betty and Peter had known each other for several years. Peter worked as a truck driver for quite a while, and they had met while he was on one of his routes one time, and eventually in 1955 they had gotten married. And they were living in Kingston, New York at the time, but the next year they would decide that Los Angeles was a better place for them. In fact, they would be very wrong about this. Because it was Halloween night of 1957 at around 11 p.m. and Betty, Peter, and their daughter Judy were all getting ready for bed. They had all just turned the lights out and gotten into their beds when they heard their doorbell ring. Peter immediately went downstairs so the lady of the house didn't have to. He thought that it was strange that it was so late, but it was Halloween night, and you know, trick-or-treaters can be ruthless. So he went downstairs and opened the door, and Betty could hear him from upstairs saying yes and then asking, "Isn't it too late for this sort of thing?" And Betty then heard some muffled voices which sounded like one was very masculine and one was a man impersonating a woman. However, they were very muffled and she couldn't really hear what exactly was being said by these guests. But then suddenly she would hear a sound that was like a pop and then a thud. And she ran downstairs, as well as Judy, who heard this as well. They ran downstairs and they found Peter lying on his back just inside the door. They also heard screeching as the tires from the vehicle in their driveway sped away. Peter had been shot in the chest, and immediately Betty ran down to their neighbor's house. His name is Bud Alper, and he worked at the LA Police Department. She started banging on his door at 11 p.m. at night. He finally came to the door and she told him what had happened. He contacted everyone at the police department and they were there within minutes. They immediately went over to Peter and began to transfer him to the Sun Valley Receiving Hospital. However, due to the amount of bleeding that was happening, he died on the way, and his cause of death was officially ruled to be a gunshot from a .38 caliber weapon, and it had lodged beneath his heart. When investigators began to search the home and the driveway for further evidence, they weren't finding any, and it didn't appear to be an attempted robbery. Nothing was stolen, and they began to look at Peter's previous criminal record to see if it was gang related, to see if he was involved with anyone who would want him dead, and they only found one minor charge 10 years prior to this on his record. So it's not like he was involved in anything bad. His friends and family said he didn't have any enemies. He really just owned his beauty shop and that was it. Like, he really took pride in what was happening in his businesses, and he kept himself out of trouble. He took care of his family, and that was all that he wanted to do. They began to interview neighbors to see if they had seen anything, and a 15-year-old witness would come forward saying that he saw a car speeding out of their neighborhood around this time that night. However, he couldn't really say anything more or even really what this car looked like. Peter's wife, Betty, even had to be sedated for several days. She sedated herself, basically, with some numbing medication to kind of overcome that pain before she could even be questioned by police. And when she was questioned, nothing really came of it because she was so disoriented and she was quite beside herself. I mean, her husband had just been shot and it was within seconds on Halloween night when he just opened the door. And, you know, people deal with grief differently, and she obviously was really, really struggling. And so it took them a while to piece together kind of the things she was saying and different people in their life that could possibly have something to do with it. So 2 long weeks went by before the police would eventually have a hunch. And this was about a woman who is 40-year-old Joan Rabel, and she had worked as a freelance photographer and writer before getting a job at the Fabiano's beauty shop. She worked there for a while, and not only did she get a job, but she also became really close with Betty Fabiano, and they were pretty close friends. So close, in fact, that eventually when Betty and Peter were having some sort of marital problems, Betty moved in with Joan for a while just to get some time away from Peter to see if that would help. It is widely speculated that Betty and Joan kind of had a more intense relationship than just friendship. However, in all of the articles in newspapers, it doesn't outright say this because it was illegal in California, unfortunately, for 2 women to be in love or be in a relationship. And as ridiculous as that is what was happening at the time. And so not many people discuss that exact fact. However, it is widely speculated that that is what was happening at the time. And when Peter began to kind of suspect this, he offered Betty to come back into his home and that they were going to work on their marriage, and that his only rule was that she would lose all contact with Joan and not even say her name in his presence. And for whatever reason, whether she wanted to be back with her husband, whether it wasn't working out with Joan, or whether it was just a fling with Joan that she didn't really want to carry on, she did go back to her husband and cut off all contact with Joan. The police then began to think Joan didn't want to accept this betrayal, and she was brought in for questioning, where she continued to say that the Fabianos were 2 of her closest friends, that she had no idea what happened. However, the police really believed that their friendship had turned sour, and she is the one who pulled the trigger that night. And on November 16th, Joan was arrested for Peter Fabiano's murder. Joan immediately said she had nothing to do with it, that her car was in the driveway the entire night, and this was true. Neighbors said that her car was there all night. However, that didn't mean that Joan was there all night, because one of her close friends named Margaret Barrett would come forward to police saying that Joan wasn't in her own car because she had borrowed Margaret's car, and she had left that night and she had put 37 miles on it and then brought it back. But Margaret didn't know where she had gone. Joan said she simply went to get groceries, that she didn't pull the trigger, and that she did not deserve to be arrested for this murder. Police didn't know if she was guilty at this point. They didn't know who was guilty, what had happened. They were still at a loss. So without any evidence to hold her, they released Joan. It would take another month for another suspect to arise, and that would be from an anonymous tip sent to the LA Police Department saying that they needed to go and check a lockbox in a certain department store. As soon as they got there to this lockbox, they found a .38 caliber gun. And when they tested it in ballistics, they found that it was exactly the same gun used on Peter Fabiano. Now they just had to figure out who owned it and who had put it there. Going through the gun shop sales records, they found that it was bought by a 43-year-old laboratory technician at the LA Children's Hospital named Goldine Pizer. And they immediately went to her home, where she confessed almost immediately, crying and saying that she had done it. She was described by others as being very meek and mousy almost. She was a small little thing. She really didn't seem to be someone who would have done this. However, she was admitting to it and said that it was a relief to finally be able to get it off her mind. But then she said something that really confused police. It wasn't her fault. When she elaborated, she said that she was put under a spell by a woman who was a good friend of hers, and basically the two of them had been inseparable for many, many years. This woman's name was Joan Rabel. Goldine said that Joan was constantly talking about this evil man named Peter Fabiano, and that he was a vile, evil man who destroyed anyone that would come close to him, that he abused his wife, and was basically this monster that needed to be destroyed. That's all the two women could really talk about. Joan was so obsessed with the fact that Peter was a monster, and Goldine, who had never really met Peter, began to feel the same way because of how Joan was talking, and so eventually she was given money by Joan to go to a gun shop. She went to one in Pasadena on September 21st, went in and asked the owner if she could buy a gun for protection. Fast forward to Halloween night, Joan would pick her up in a borrowed car at her home with a whole bunch of clothes in the back seat for her to put on. They consisted of blue jeans, khaki jackets, eye masks, makeup, red gloves, anything to disguise themselves in. She also had a paper bag where she concealed the gun. No one would think anything of this strange outfit either because it was Halloween. Everybody was in costumes. They got to the Fabiano's house at around 9 p.m. and waited for all of their lights to go out. When they did, at around 11 p.m., Goldine then got out of the car with the gun and the paper bag and walked up to the Fabiano's door, ringing the doorbell twice before Peter finally opened it, and she raised the gun still in the paper bag and shot him. Immediately she ran back to the car, to Joan, where Joan kissed her and said thank you. Joan then sped away and went and dropped the car back off to the rightful owner, Margaret, and then Joan told Goldine, "Forget you ever knew me," and walked in a completely different direction. At this point, Goldine decided to burn all of the clothes she was wearing, as well as storing this gun in a department store lockbox. But now she and Joan were going on trial for his murder. And Goldine cried, saying that she truly believed that Peter was this symbol of evil, and a doctor said that Goldine was a passive person who was really putty in the hands of Joan Rabel. Goldine said, "I have no motive personally. Whatever motive I had was to please Joan. I was always easily influenced. I have been impressionable and always trusting." And at first, Joan pleaded not guilty, and Goldine pleaded guilty by reason of insanity. However, that would change on March 11th, 1958, when they both took a plea deal saying that they were guilty in exchange for 5 years to life. Goldine was eventually released from prison and worked at a professional women's club until the age of 83 when she passed. However, it's not known whatever happened to Joan, if she was released, if she lived out her days in prison. No one really knows. However, we do know that Peter's wife, Betty, was never remarried. But I think that the bigger takeaway of this case is that anyone can truly be persuaded by anyone, and you really have to be careful what you are allowing to soak into your own thoughts, because I think if you're only getting one side of the story all of the time and never getting any other insight, it can be really detrimental, and suddenly your thoughts are only the copycat of somebody else's, because you are not allowing yourself to learn and to experience the world from your own eyes. You're only taking it from theirs. I think that that's actually something that happens in a lot of relationships, especially more abusive and manipulative, and when you're dealing with a narcissist, it's something that can happen a lot, that they only want your thoughts to be just a copy of their own, and it's quite scary. So if you ever find yourself in a situation where you feel like you're not allowed to have your own thoughts or your own opinions, I would definitely just look a little bit closer at who you are surrounding yourself with. I mean, narcissists will have you believing the strangest things without a doubt in your mind because they've isolated you from the actual truth. So I love to put messages like that at the end in case you kind of resonated with the story and you thought possibly this is something that's happening to you. I just want you to know that not only are you not alone, because a lot of people deal with narcissists and people who really only want you in their life to control you. But you're also not weak because you've let that happen to you. It's something that can happen without your knowledge. You can be the strongest person in the world and you're suddenly just completely in a trance because of these people, and your mind is twisted and you don't even know what you believe anymore, or you stop following your gut instincts. But if something told you that this video, that this message is for you, it probably is. And I truly hope that you get out of the situation that you're in, because I want the best for all of you. But there is a theory that I wanted to bring up to you guys, and that is, do you think that Peter's wife Betty had anything to do with it? She was with Joan for a while prior to going back to her husband. Did she go back to her husband only to make him trust her in order to get Joan to have him murdered so she could get the money and Joan? Or do you think she had nothing to do with it? I think it's pretty elaborate. I mean, why would she have had to go back to her husband? I mean, I guess in a way that kind of made her look a little less guilty because she was with him and not with Joan. And there wasn't, marital problems happening at the time. So I could see in that way. However, just from how she reacted to his death, unless she was a wonderful actress, I am just leaning more towards that she really had nothing to do with it, and that she wanted to go back to her husband, probably more for her kids than anything. I think parents, especially mothers, will do anything to keep the family together and to, make their kids feel like they have a secure family. So I'm sure that was part of the reason why she went back to him. So I really do think that Joan kind of just had this obsession with Betty and didn't want to let her go. But I'd love to hear your theories about this case. I feel like I look like some sort of like old school detective, like a Sherlock Holmes type. I don't know, I'm really liking this hat. But anyways, I really hope that you are loving ODDtober. I almost said October. How rude of me. ODDtober. And I will list a playlist down below of all of the ODDtober videos I have done this month if you have missed any, and as well as I will list the playlist of the videos I did last Halloween. So don't ever forget to speak up. Your voice is powerful enough, and I love you to absolute pieces. Okay, bye.